In the early 1900s, vicious attacks against African Americans were almost as common in the North as in the South. In the summer of 1908, a white mob attacked African Americans in Springfield, Illinois. During the riot, 2 black men were lynched, dozens more injured, and homes and businesses were destroyed and burned. Thousands of African Americans fled the city in search of safety.
And this riot in the hometown of Abraham Lincoln really upsets a lot of people who had hoped for better for American race relations.
After the Springfield riot, William E. Walling, a white Harvard-educated socialist and labor reformer from Kentucky, wrote an article for a liberal periodical, The Independent, and described the violence against African Americans. Disturbed by the increasing number of attacks against blacks, he called for a large and powerful body of citizens to come to their aid.
Many whites and blacks saw the need for an organization that would be a kind of national presence, both in speaking out against this kind of racial terrorism, but also beginning to advocate politically and legally for the rights of African Americans.
Mary Ovington, a journalist and reformer, responded to Walling's article. On February 12, 1909, the 100th anniversary of Abraham Lincoln's birthday, Ovington and Walling called for a national conference to address racial justice. 3 months later, black and white social workers, intellectuals, educators, reformers, and lawyers met in New York City and established the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People.
Its founders include not only black leaders such as W.E.B. Du Bois, but reformers like Jane Addams, Rabbi Stephen Wise, a whole series of people who are coming out of women's organizations.
The mission of the NAACP was to end forced segregation and racial violence and to ensure civil liberties for all. In 1915, lawyers for the NAACP won a Supreme Court case which ruled that the grandfather clause used by some states to stop blacks from voting was unconstitutional. Another early success came in 1917 when the Supreme Court declared segregated housing was unconstitutional.
They focused on litigation, changing the laws, and so therefore they lobbied through Congress and with the president to get the federal government to transform state laws to ensure the civil rights of blacks, but also education. They believed that you could change the hearts of white America if you could re-educate them.
One way the NAACP re-educated people was through a monthly magazine called The Crisis. The magazine, edited by W.E.B. Du Bois, served as a newspaper, a literary review, and a voice for the rights of men irrespective of color or race. Du Bois wrote eloquent and forceful articles in the magazine to report and denounce racial segregation and injustice. In 1919, the NAACP published a study on the lynching and racial violence of the previous 30 years. Members of the NAACP worked continuously for anti-lynching legislation, but it never passed.
In the first decade of the NAACP's existence, it didn't get a lot of attention. It was a small organization, it never had enough money. World War I changes that. The events of the war, the politics of race during the war send hundreds of thousands of members into the organization and really transform it into a mass membership organization.
By 1920, the NAACP had more than 300 local branches across the United States and almost 100,000 members. As their numbers grew, so did their impact. In the fight against Jim Crow and segregation, the NAACP would become one of the leading protest organizations in the United States.